Hearst Castle, America's most expensive castle, built over 28 years, a symbol of opulence and grandeur, is often seen as the ultimate achievement of wealth and vision. But behind its glittering facade lies a darker story, a vision fueled by obsession and a relentless desire for control. It was a castle built on the exploitation of workers, the neglect of personal relationships, and a spiraling financial burden. It's a story of excess and human cost, where luxury and tragedy collide, and the legacy of one man's dream is forever shadowed by the price he was willing to pay to make it real. William Randolph Hearst was born into wealth, but not into contentment. His mother, Phoebe Apperson Hearst, was a woman of refined tastes and iron will. She collected art like other women collected recipes. She travelled Europe with young William in tow, dragging him through castles and cathedrals, palaces and museums. Every gilded ceiling, every marble column, every tapestry, she made him see them, made him understand what money could become when transformed into beauty, and William learned. He learned too well. By the time he was a young man, Hearst had already begun building his empire. Not an empire of stone, not yet. An empire of paper and ink. He took control of the San Francisco Examiner in 1887, a gift from his father. Within years, he transformed it from a struggling daily into a powerhouse of sensational journalism. He mastered the art of making people feel outrage, fear, excitement. He understood that truth was less important than emotion, and emotion sold papers. He expanded New York, Chicago, Los Angeles. By the early 1900s, Hearst owned nearly 30 newspapers and a dozen magazines. He shaped public opinion. He influenced elections. Some said he helped start the Spanish-American War with his inflammatory headlines. Whether true or not, the accusation captured something essential about William Randolph Hearst. He believed he could bend reality to his will, but for all his power, Hearst felt hollow. His marriage to Millicent Wilson in 1903 was respectable, proper, socially advantageous. They had 5 sons together, but there was no passion, no fire. Hearst moved through the obligations of family life like a man performing a role he'd never auditioned for. He provided, he appeared at functions. But his heart was elsewhere. It was always elsewhere. In 1915, everything changed. Hearst met Marion Davies, a chorus girl with blonde curls and a luminous smile. She was 19, he was 52. The age difference didn't matter to him. Neither did his marriage. Marion became his obsession, his muse, his reason. He poured millions into her film career, convinced he could make her a star through sheer force of will and wealth. Critics dismissed her. Audiences were lukewarm. But Hearst never stopped believing, and Marion, for her part, loved him back. Not for his money, though that helped. Not for his power, though that impressed her. She loved him because he needed her in a way that made him almost human, almost vulnerable. But where could they go? A married man and his mistress couldn't live openly in respectable society. Hearst needed a kingdom of his own, a place where social rules didn't apply, a place where he could be who he wanted to be, with whom he wanted to be with. He needed a castle. The land was already his. His mother had purchased 40,000 acres of California ranch land near San Simeon decades earlier. Young William had camped there as a child, sleeping under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. After Phoebe died in 1919, the land became his, along with her entire fortune. And that's when the vision crystallized. Hearst summoned Julia Morgan to his office in 1919. Morgan was already famous, the first woman licensed to practice architecture in California, a graduate of the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. She'd designed hundreds of buildings, but nothing like what Hearst was about to propose. He spread his hands as if unveiling something already built. "I would like to build something up on the hill at San Simeon," he told her. "I get tired of going up there and camping in tents. I'm getting a little old for that. I'd like to get something that would be more comfortable. Something comfortable." That's what he said. What he meant was a monument, a palace, a retreat that would rival anything European royalty had ever constructed. He wanted swimming pools lined with Venetian glass. He wanted gardens that would make Versailles jealous. He wanted rooms filled with centuries-old art, ceilings transported from Italian monasteries, tapestries that once hung in Spanish castles. He wanted everything he'd seen as a child, compressed into one impossible place. Morgan listened. She was practical, methodical, brilliant. She knew what Hearst was asking for would take years, decades perhaps. The site was remote, 5 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by rough mountain paths. Every piece of material, every tile and timber would have to be hauled up steep slopes. Water would need to be piped in, power lines run. The logistics alone were staggering, but she said yes. Perhaps she saw it as the challenge of a lifetime. Perhaps she believed in Hearst's vision. Or perhaps, like so many who entered Hearst's orbit, she simply couldn't say no to a man who believed so completely in his own dreams. Construction began in 1919. The main house, La Casa Grande, would sit atop the hill like a cathedral. 3 guest houses would surround it, each one larger than most Americans' homes. The style would be Mediterranean revival, a fantasy of Spanish missions and Moorish palaces blended together. Morgan worked with painstaking precision. Hearst worked with manic enthusiasm. He sent her telegrams constantly, dozens a week, sometimes several a day. Change this, add that, make it bigger, make it grander. He bought entire ceilings from European buildings and had them shipped across the Atlantic. He purchased choir stalls from churches, mantels from palaces, whole rooms from villas. Each piece had to be catalogued, transported, reassembled. The castle became his obsession. Not just a home, not just a retreat. It was the physical manifestation of everything he felt he deserved. Everything he'd been denied by his loveless marriage, his distant mother, his inability to connect with his own sons. Here, finally, was something he could control completely. Marion loved it. She swam in the Neptune pool beneath Roman colonnades. She sunbathed on terraces overlooking the Pacific. She hosted parties where Hollywood's elite mingled with politicians and newspaper magnates. Here, she wasn't Hearst's mistress. She was his hostess, his companion, his queen, and Hearst, for a few years, was happy. But even then, in those early days of construction, there were signs. Costs were mounting. Workers were struggling. The remoteness that made the castle so private also made it nearly impossible to build, and Hearst's vision kept expanding, always expanding, like a hunger that couldn't be satisfied. Julia Morgan sensed it. She wrote in her notes about the endless changes and constant additions. But she kept building. What else could she do? This was her masterpiece too. By 1925, the basic structures were complete. But Hearst wasn't finished. He would never be finished. There were always more rooms to add, more art to install, more perfection to chase. The castle became a living thing, constantly growing, constantly demanding, and beneath the beauty, beneath the marble and gold, something else was growing too. A debt. Not just financial, though that was real enough. A deeper debt. The kind paid in human exhaustion, in dreams deferred, in lives bent to serve one man's vision of paradise. But none of that was visible yet. Not to visitors who gasped at the Roman pool's azure tiles, not to guests who dined beneath hand-carved ceilings, not even to Hearst himself, who walked through his creation and saw only what he'd dreamed, not what it had cost. The foundation was laid, the dream was taking shape, and the price, the real price, was still being calculated. Every morning, before dawn, they came up the hill, workers in dusty trucks, rattling along dirt roads that turned to mud when it rained, stonemasons and carpenters, electricians and plumbers, craftsmen and labourers. At the peak of construction, more than 400 men worked on Hearst Castle simultaneously. Some stayed for weeks, others for years, a few for more than a decade. They built paradise for a man who would never know their names. The work was brutal. The site sat 600 feet above sea level, exposed to wind and sun. In summer, temperatures climbed into the 90s. Workers hauled stone and timber up steep paths, their backs bent under weight that would have crushed lesser men. In winter, rain turned the construction site into a mud pit. Work slowed, but never stopped. Hearst wouldn't allow it. He demanded perfection. Every tile had to be placed exactly right. Every piece of carved stone had to align with Morgan's meticulous drawings. If something wasn't perfect, Hearst ordered it torn down and rebuilt. A fireplace might be dismantled because the proportions displeased him. An entire room might be reconfigured because he'd changed his mind about the colour scheme. The workers rarely complained, not openly. Jobs were scarce in rural California. The pay was decent when it came, but there were whispers, stories traded over lunch about wages delayed, about promises broken. Some workers left without being paid at all, their labour absorbed into the castle's foundations like mortar. Julia Morgan tried to manage the chaos. She travelled to the site every week, sometimes staying for days. She reviewed every detail, approved every change, mediated between Hearst's impossible demands and the practical limitations of physics and human endurance. She worked without rest, often sleeping in temporary quarters on site, rising before dawn to inspect the previous day's progress. She was paid well. Hearst was generous with his architect. But even Morgan began to feel the weight of the project. In her private correspondence, she confessed exhaustion. "The work never ends," she wrote to a friend. "Every solution creates 3 new problems." But it wasn't just the scale that exhausted her. It was the futility. She was building something that would never be finished. Hearst's vision was infinite. The castle would never satisfy him because satisfaction wasn't the point. The building itself was the point, the endless creation, the perpetual transformation of money and labour into physical beauty. By 1925, Hearst had already spent more than $5 million on construction. That's equivalent to roughly $80 million today. And the castle was barely half finished. The main house still lacked entire wings. The art collection was growing daily, crates arriving from European dealers, each one containing treasures that needed to be uncrated, catalogued, installed. Hearst bought faster than Morgan could incorporate. Storage warehouses in San Simeon overflowed with statues, paintings, furniture. Millions of dollars of art waiting for rooms that hadn't been built yet. The estate required constant maintenance. Gardens needed tending. Pools needed cleaning. The private zoo, Hearst had built a massive zoo with lions, bears, zebras, elephants, required keepers and veterinarians. He employed a full-time staff of servants, groundskeepers, and animal handlers. At any given time, 50 to 70 people lived on the property just to keep it operational. This was Hearst's world, a world that required hundreds of people working constantly, invisibly, to maintain his dream. The guests who visited never saw this infrastructure. They arrived to find everything perfect. Fresh flowers in every room, meals prepared by skilled chefs, swimming pools shimmering, tennis courts manicured. They swan through a fantasy carefully maintained by people who remained unseen. Marion Davies understood this better than Hearst. She was kind to the staff. She remembered names, asked about families. Workers loved her because she treated them like human beings, not like the furniture that surrounded them. She'd come from nothing herself, a chorus line, not a mansion, and she never forgot it. But kindness couldn't change the fundamental equation. The castle required sacrifice. It consumed resources, money, time, human energy, at an astonishing rate. And Hearst, insulated by wealth and ego, couldn't see it. Or wouldn't. His newspapers were still printing money. His empire still sprawled across the country. He believed himself invincible, untouchable. He believed his wealth would last forever, that he could keep building forever, that the dream would never have to end. The numbers tell a different story. By 1930, Hearst had spent an estimated $10 million on the castle. That's $165 million in today's dollars, and it still wasn't finished. Construction crews still swarmed over the site. New buildings were being added, a new wing here, a guest cottage there. The art collection continued to grow. Hearst bought a medieval Spanish ceiling for $50,000, a set of choir stalls for $75,000, a painting for $200,000. Each purchase justified by aesthetic vision, none by financial prudence. His accountants were becoming nervous. The depression was beginning to bite. Advertising revenue was dropping. Newspapers were struggling. Hearst's empire was generating less cash, but his spending never slowed. The castle was a vortex, pulling money in faster than even his vast fortune could supply it. But Hearst couldn't stop. The castle wasn't just a home. It was his identity. It was proof that he mattered, that his life meant something, that he could create beauty in a world that often seemed ugly. To stop building would be to admit defeat, to acknowledge limits, and William Randolph Hearst had never acknowledged limits in his life. So the work continued. The bills piled up. The workers kept coming up the hill, their faces weathered by sun and wind, their bodies bent by labour. They built terraces and fountains, colonnades and staircases. They installed floors imported from Italian palaces and ceilings from Spanish monasteries. They created with their own hands one man's vision of perfection, and they were forgotten. Their names weren't recorded, their stories weren't told. They existed only as tools, as means to an end. The castle rose, magnificent and gleaming, and their anonymity was its foundation. Julia Morgan felt this more acutely as the years passed. She was complicit, she knew. Her genius made the castle possible. Her skill transformed Hearst's fever dreams into physical reality. Without her, the castle would have been a disaster, a gaudy mess of conflicting styles and impossible proportions. With her, it became art. But at what cost? She watched workers injured in accidents, their medical bills paid grudgingly, if at all. She saw families disrupted, men spending months away from home to earn wages that barely covered their expenses. She knew that the beauty surrounding her was built on foundations of human exhaustion. And still she kept working, because she was trapped too in her own way. This was her masterpiece, the work that would define her career. She couldn't walk away any more than Hearst could stop building. They were bound together, architect and patron, locked in a dance that would consume them both. By 1932, the castle had cost Hearst nearly $20 million, over $300 million in today's currency. The estate sprawled across 127 acres of developed land, surrounded by thousands of acres of ranch. La Casa Grande contained 68,500 square feet of living space, 60 bedrooms, 41 bathrooms, 18 sitting rooms. The Neptune pool held 345,000 gallons of water. The indoor Roman pool was lined with over 1 million tiles of Venetian glass, each one placed by hand. The scale was staggering, inhuman almost. It represented not just wealth, but the concentration of wealth to a degree most Americans couldn't fathom. In the middle of the Depression, while families lost their homes and children went hungry, Hearst was installing gold-leafed ceilings and importing marble columns from ancient Roman villas. The contradiction was stark. Hearst's newspapers championed the common man. His editorials railed against corporate greed and economic inequality. He positioned himself as a populist, a defender of working people against the robber barons and the elite. But at San Simeon he was building a monument to excess that made those robber barons look modest. The workers saw it. How could they not? They built rooms larger than their entire houses. They installed bathtubs that cost more than they'd earn in a lifetime. They carried statues worth more than their children would see in a generation. The irony was impossible to miss, but they kept working. Because they needed the jobs. Because the alternative was unemployment and hunger. Because that's what workers have always done. Built palaces for kings who never learned their names. And Hearst, wandering through his half-finished paradise with Marion on his arm, never saw the contradiction. He saw beauty. He saw art. He saw his vision taking shape. He saw everything except the truth. That his dream was devouring lives as surely as it was consuming money. The castle was nearly complete. But the cost, the real cost, was only beginning to come due. The telegram arrived on October 29, 1929. Hearst was at San Simeon, standing on one of his terraces, watching the sun set over the Pacific. The message was brief, clinical. The stock market had collapsed. Billions of dollars had evaporated in hours. The American economy was in freefall. Hearst crumpled the telegram and went inside for dinner. He didn't understand. Not yet. Men like William Randolph Hearst don't go broke overnight. His empire was too vast, too diversified. He owned newspapers, magazines, radio stations, movie studios. He owned real estate across the country. He owned mines and ranches and warehouses full of priceless art. How could one bad day on Wall Street threaten all of that? But it did, and it would. The Depression didn't strike Hearst immediately. For a few years he maintained the illusion of invincibility. Construction at San Simeon continued. Guests still came for weekends of luxury. Marion still hosted parties where champagne flowed and movie stars danced on terraces overlooking the sea. But beneath the surface the empire was cracking. Newspaper circulation was dropping. Advertising revenue was collapsing. Americans couldn't afford to buy papers anymore. They couldn't afford to buy the products advertised in those papers. Hearst's cash flow, the river of money that had seemed inexhaustible, was slowing to a trickle, and Hearst couldn't stop spending. The castle still demanded money, the staff still needed wages, the maintenance costs alone were staggering, $50,000 a month just to keep the estate running. The art collection still grew. Hearst still bought compulsively, unable to break the habit of acquisition. His accountants pleaded with him, cut costs, sell assets, reduce spending, but Hearst refused. He'd built an empire by refusing to acknowledge limits. He wasn't about to start now. By 1935, the situation was dire. Hearst's companies were losing millions of dollars annually. His debt was mounting. Banks were circling, demanding repayment on loans he'd taken during the boom years. His advisors warned him, without dramatic action, he would lose everything. Finally, Hearst blinked. Construction at San Simeon stopped in 1937. After 18 years of constant building, the hammers fell silent. Workers were dismissed, sent back down the hill to uncertain futures. Julia Morgan made her final visit to the site she'd devoted 2 decades to. The castle would remain unfinished, forever incomplete. But stopping construction wasn't enough. Hearst needed cash, millions of dollars, immediately. He began selling his art collection, the treasures he'd spent decades acquiring, a painting here, a tapestry there. The sales were quiet, handled through dealers who promised discretion, but word leaked out. William Randolph Hearst, the man who owned everything, was selling his possessions to survive. The humiliation cut deep. This was a man who'd never been denied anything, who'd bought newspapers like other men bought suits, who'd built a castle because he wanted one. Now he was reduced to selling off pieces of his dream to creditors who didn't care about beauty or vision or art. His family relationships, already strained, reached the breaking point. Millicent, his wife, had endured decades of public humiliation, as Hearst paraded Marion Davies around like a queen. She'd raised their 5 sons largely alone while Hearst played house on his hilltop. Now, with the empire collapsing, the sons began to assert themselves. They wanted control. They wanted to save what could be saved. Hearst resisted. This was his empire, his creation. He'd built it, and he'd decide its fate. But he was 74 years old. His health was failing. His energy was waning. For the first time in his life, William Randolph Hearst was losing. The nadir came in 1937. Hearst was forced to accept a financial conservatorship. Control of his empire was transferred to a trust managed by professional executives. His spending would be monitored, his decisions overridden. He was allowed to keep San Simeon and a few other properties, but the vast majority of his assets were beyond his control. It was death before dying, to be alive but powerless, to be present but voiceless, to watch others manage the empire he'd built with his own ruthless ambition. Marion stayed with him. She could have left. Many expected her to. She was still young, still beautiful. She could have found another man, another life. But she loved him. Not the powerful newspaper magnate he'd been, but the old man he'd become. She stayed at San Simeon, swimming in the empty pools, walking through rooms that would never be completed. Hearst was broken. The castle, his monument to himself, stood around him like a mausoleum. He wandered its corridors, past art he could no longer afford, through rooms built by workers he'd never paid properly. The guests were gone. The parties were over. The dream that had driven him for decades lay shattered around him, like the pieces of a statue he'd smashed in anger. He'd wanted immortality. He'd wanted to create something that would outlast him, that would prove he mattered. Instead, he'd created a monument to his own hubris. A castle built on exploitation and excess, financed by an empire that was collapsing even as the walls rose. The unfinished rooms haunted him. Spaces that were supposed to hold treasures from European palaces sat empty. Wings that were supposed to house additional guest suites remained skeletal frameworks. Storage buildings overflowed with art he'd bought but never found room for. The castle was a physical manifestation of insatiable hunger, of desire that could never be satisfied. In his private moments, and there were many now as the castle grew quiet and lonely, Hearst must have wondered, was it worth it? All the money, all the labour, all the relationships destroyed. For what? For rooms he'd never complete, and art he'd had to sell. For a paradise that felt increasingly like a prison. The workers he'd employed were gone, Scattered across California, their stories forgotten, Julia Morgan had moved on to other projects. The castle she'd poured her genius into left incomplete. Marion was loyal, but even her presence couldn't fill the emptiness. Hearst had spent his life believing he could shape reality through force of will and weight of wealth. But reality was proving stronger. The Depression had broken his empire, age had broken his body, and the castle, his magnificent, impossible castle, had broken something deeper. Some part of his soul that believed dreams could be made real if you just refused to acknowledge the cost. The hilltop that had once buzzed with activity was quiet now. The ocean crashed below, the wind moved through empty rooms, and William Randolph Hearst, the most powerful newspaper magnate in American history, sat alone in his unfinished paradise, counting the cost of everything he'd lost in pursuit of a dream. William Randolph Hearst died on August 14, 1951, in Beverly Hills. He was 88 years old. He died not at San Simeon, the paradise he'd spent decades building, but in Marion Davies' house, because his own castle had become too expensive to maintain. The staff had been reduced to a skeleton crew. Many rooms were closed off. The pools, once filled with laughing guests, were often drained to save on maintenance costs. The dream had outlived its dreamer, but just barely. Marion Davies was with him at the end. Millicent, his wife of nearly 50 years, was not. Their sons came to the funeral. The newspaper empire they had inherited was diminished but still operational, a shadow of what their father had built. They would spend decades trying to rebuild what the Depression and their father's excesses had nearly destroyed. But what about the castle? What happens to a dream when the dreamer dies? Initially, the Hearst family tried to keep San Simeon private, but the costs were overwhelming. The estate required constant maintenance, pipes to repair, roofs to maintain, grounds to tend. Without Hearst's manic energy and Marion's warmth, it felt empty, a monument without a purpose. In 1957, the family made a decision that would have horrified William Randolph Hearst. They donated the castle to the state of California. The house he'd built as a private retreat, a refuge from the world, would become a public museum. Tourists would walk through his bedrooms, strangers would swim in his pools. The sanctuary he'd created to escape public scrutiny would become one of California's most popular tourist attractions. The irony was perfect, and somehow fitting. Hearst Castle opened to the public in 1958. Visitors came by the thousands, then by the hundreds of thousands. They marvelled at the opulence, the scale, the sheer audacity of the place. They walked through rooms filled with priceless art and furniture, gazed at pools that seemed transplanted from Roman emperors' estates, stood on terraces overlooking views that took their breath away. What they didn't see were the workers who'd built it. The men who'd hauled stone up impossible slopes, who'd placed millions of tiles by hand, who'd sacrificed their bodies and years of their lives to make one man's vision real. Their names weren't on plaques, their stories weren't told in the guided tours. Julia Morgan's contribution was barely acknowledged for decades. She'd designed every detail, solved every impossible problem Hearst threw at her, devoted nearly 30 years of her life to this project. But in the early tours she was mentioned only in passing, if at all. The castle was presented as Hearst's vision, and that was true. But it was Morgan's skill that made the vision possible. It took years for her role to be properly recognised. Decades before the California park system began crediting her properly, before historians began documenting her contributions, before she was given her rightful place in the story. She died in 1957, the same year the castle was donated, having spent the last decades of her life working on other projects, the masterpiece of her career left unfinished and unacknowledged. The castle itself tells a story its creator never intended. Yes, it's beautiful, breathtakingly so. The Roman pool's azure and gold tiles still shimmer. The Neptune pool's colonnade still frame the Pacific perfectly. The art collection, what remains of it, is still impressive. But walking through those rooms today, knowing the history, you can't escape the darker truth. This is a monument to obsession, to the belief that enough money and enough will can create paradise, to the idea that one man's vision is worth any cost, paid by anyone but himself. The unfinished rooms remain unfinished. They're part of the tour now. Guides explain that Hearst ran out of money, that construction stopped before his dream was complete. Visitors nod sympathetically as if this were a tragedy. But perhaps it's fitting. Perhaps a dream built on such foundations deserves to remain incomplete. What would the castle have looked like if it had been finished? No one knows. Hearst plans kept evolving, expanding, changing. There was always another wing to add, another room to perfect, another piece of art to install. The castle wasn't designed to be finished. It was designed to be eternal pursuit, endless creation, perpetual transformation. In that sense, it's perfect as it stands. Incomplete. Frozen in mid-transformation. A monument to the impossibility of satisfying limitless desire. Today, Hearst Castle receives nearly 1 million visitors annually. It generates millions in revenue for California's park system. It's one of the state's most iconic landmarks, as recognizable as the Golden Gate Bridge or Yosemite. It has achieved a kind of immortality that Hearst craved. But it's not his immortality, it's something else. A cautionary tale disguised as a tourist attraction. A beautiful warning about the cost of obsession. The tourists who visit rarely think about this. They see the surface, the beauty, the grandeur, the breathtaking achievement, and that's understandable. It is beautiful. It is grand. It is an achievement. But beauty always has a source. Grandeur always has a price. Achievement always requires sacrifice. The question is, who pays? At Hearst Castle, the answer is clear. Workers paid with their labour and health. Julia Morgan paid with decades of her life. Hearst's family paid with abandonment and emotional neglect. Marion Davies paid with her reputation and any chance at a conventional life. And Hearst himself paid with his fortune, his empire, and ultimately his peace. Was it worth it? Walk through the castle and decide for yourself. Stand in the Neptune pool at sunset the way Hearst did. Look at the view he obsessed over. Feel the grandeur he created. Then think about the workers who built what you're standing on. Think about the architect whose genius made it possible. Think about the family who lived in the shadow of this obsession. Think about the man who died in another woman's house because his own dream had become too expensive to inhabit. The castle endures. Stone and tile, marble and gold, these things last. But the people who created it are gone. Their stories mostly lost. Their sacrifices mostly forgotten. That's the legacy of Hearst Castle. Not just beauty, but the cost of beauty. Not just achievement, but the price of achievement. Not just one man's dream realized, but hundreds of people's dreams deferred or destroyed in service of that realization. William Randolph Hearst wanted to build something that would outlast him. He succeeded. But the monument he left behind doesn't celebrate him the way he hoped. It reveals him. His ambition, yes. His vision, certainly. But also his blindness. His inability to see beyond his own desires. His willingness to consume everything. Money, labor, relationships, lives, in pursuit of an ideal that could never be reached. The castle stands on its hilltop, beautiful and broken, complete and unfinished. A triumph and a tragedy. It's exactly what William Randolph Hearst deserved. Not what he wanted, but what he earned. And perhaps that's the truest legacy any of us leave behind. Not what we intended, but what we actually created. Not how we saw ourselves, but how others saw us. Not the dream we chased, but the reality we built while chasing it. Hearst Castle is that reality. Magnificent and hollow, inspiring and cautionary. A paradise built on sacrifice, standing forever as a reminder that some dreams cost too much, even when they come true. The stories of America's grandest estates are never simple. Behind every mansion, there's a human story. Ambition and obsession, triumph and tragedy, dreams that became monuments and monuments that became warnings. What estate should we explore next? The Vanderbilts' Biltmore, built on different ambitions with its own hidden costs? Perhaps the Rockefellers' Kikuit, where family legacy and personal vision collided? Or another California palace, built by different dreamers with similar obsessions? Leave a comment below. Tell us which American estate story you want to hear, and if this journey into Hearst Castle's hidden history moved you, hit that like button and subscribe. These stories matter. The people behind them matter, and someone needs to tell their stories completely. The beauty and the cost, the dream and the price. Until next time, remember, every paradise has foundations, and those foundations are always human.